When you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. But life, that's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you.
Jeff was a high school math teacher until he traded his blackboard for the big board in 1976.
From helping Bill get drugs in order to deal with the consequences of sex with Russian girls.
You've seen the pictures. There was one time when I was sitting up and I got a back row.
You got cats getting paid $200, $300 million. $200-300 million.
If I was in the forest and I had to run from the lion or figure out a way not to be eaten, and my competition is a local African, I'm the one who's getting eaten.
I did take those plane trips with him.
It's a Boeing 727. I'm just wondering now, what do you need a commercial-size airliner for?
Professional jokes in professional situations.
And you have a right to ask those questions.
Atlanta is a grooming-ass city.
Okay.
Atlanta groomed us niggas since we was 10, around 12, on club night.
To add insult to injury, you then subsequently, with tears in your eyes, implore me to please delete the emails regarding your STD.
Biological brainwashing, brainstorming, brainlifting, with nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people.
The most beautiful of women handed him the beaker. His heart and mind shuddered with sweet horror. He emptied it to the last drop. Then the dwarf said at the door, "Now you belong to us, for this is Venus Mountain."
All right, welcome back to the show. I know it's been about a month, maybe a little more, since I did an episode, but I was thinking about how I could cover the Epstein files. Obviously, this is right up our alley in terms of the more conspiratorial side of the show. You know, less of the comedic elements and very much into my interest in parapolitics, as I guess it's called, conspiracy theory. So I prefer. There's just so many different avenues you can go down into the story now. So many potential angles you could take on this. Today, I think I want to compare figures like Epstein, like who he was and how he fits into the framework of other people, like how Adnan Khashoggi used to operate. I want to get into the origins of how Jeffrey Epstein made his money. I want to give examples of other intelligence operations that kind of deal in this world, whether it's offshore banking or illicit deals. You know, Epstein as a figure can be somewhat tough and always has been tough to pin down just who he is, because he actually does have so many random connections. Still somewhat unclear origins, and there's so many files and stories that haven't been told at all yet. Also, the more out there conspiracy stuff that has always muddied the waters, the misdirection is on purpose, by the way. Not saying everything that's way out there is fake, because a lot of it's probably true, but schizos and random, spooks are out there pushing stories that aren't true, or just giving you in one avenue to go down, one acceptable narrative to follow. It's like that Netflix documentary they did a few years back. Epstein is presented as just some rich guy. But to their credit, they actually do focus on the girls in Florida that he abused and that led to his arrest initially. But that's the only place they want you to focus. This whole story is presented as an issue of class and wealth only. Don't look into how he got rich. Don't look into what he does outside of that. Don't look at who he knows and how he knows these people. But then later, now we get into the emails and the files in general and see just how expansive all this really gets and what his role in the system we live under is or was. If he's dead, maybe we get into that. Maybe we have a little discussion here presenting whether Epstein is actually dead or not. Because I was pretty sold on that. It used to be the case was, did he kill himself or was he murdered? I think we all fall in the he was murdered camp now, but is it actually a case between is he alive or not? Was he actually murdered? The suicide angle seems to be like the least likely one out of all of them. And pretty much whatever article you read, podcast, video, whatever, is going to have a point of view and focus on the life and connections of Epstein, leaving out plenty of information or certain disinformation and misinformation being left in. There are a lot of limited hangouts going on. I'm not knowingly leaving any misinformation in. If I do, by the way, I'm trying to, act as a real investigator now. But it's fun though. But Epstein, just this guy, you could compare him to other people that operate in this sort of way. Adnan Khashoggi, Mark Rich, perhaps even someone like Edmund Safra, though there's less evidence for him. Mark Rich, I've talked about him before on a stream, I think. He was, on the one hand, wanted by the U.S. government. He had to flee the country. And then on the other hand, another part of the U.S. government was using him as someone to introduce him to certain people, certain contacts, as a back channel to countries that we didn't have good diplomatic relations with. And then also he was doing services for Israel, mainly the oil trade between them and Iran, these secret oil deals that they used to do. Maybe they still do. Who knows, man? On the surface, about to go to war with each other, and then behind closed doors, making oil deals. So I'll get into Adnan Khashoggi, who is probably the best prototype for Jeffrey Epstein, even though Epstein is more secretive and way more behind the scenes than Khashoggi. Even when they tried to give him the PR campaign, the Vanity Fair articles, the VH1, what was the insane life of rich people on VH1, or whatever the fuck that show was called. Let's go into the early days of Epstein and try to sort all this out. So we know the Dalton School years, the mathematics. And then there's stories about him going to England, making contacts there in the 70s, supposedly as a pianist, playing the piano. He was meeting important British business people like James Goldsmith back then, who was a corporate raider, I believe. And he had some obvious connections, just like Mr. Epstein did. And these early travels to England is how it got started, is as far as his connections to the royal family. I don't think his connections to Prince Andrew were this early. I think that's where he got them through Ghislaine later on. But we get to 1981. Epstein working for Bear Stearns in New York, and he's involved in insider trading according to files at the SEC. No one can exactly agree upon how he got this job at Bear Stearns or why he lost it. There's somehow, some way he got a connection through the Dalton School, the math teacher gig he had. He was dating the boss's daughter, and yeah, he just moved up in this company in pretty short order. But again, he's involved in insider trading. There's some expense account improprieties, and he's either fired or left on his own without issue. The insider trading was on a merger of Seagram's, and Jeff resigns the next day. He was being fined by Bear Stearns for that impropriety. He supposedly gave $2,500 loan to his friend. And the SEC was very skeptical about the timing of all this, his departure and his denial of involvement in the insider trading. But he wasn't charged. Again, this is a common thing where he just gets to skate on charges that everybody else would seem to be arrested on. So this is from Whitney Webb's book, and the question is raised as, was the information coming from Bronfman that he was being investigated, or was it coming through Ace Greenberg, who was, the boss at Bear Stearns and the father of the woman that Epstein was dating? So Epstein sets up Intercontinental Asset Group, his company, in the late 1980s, up through 1988. And very little is known about this. And he claims he was managing the wealth of billionaires. And not very much evidence. Claimed to be a bounty hunter. He helped to hide or retrieve stolen assets. recover money for various governments or very rich people. That's what he said he was doing. And this makes sense to me. As I'll explain later, the connections between England and his travels back and forth there, which is documented through the 1980s, makes sense if he is someone who's laundering money or hiding assets or being used as someone who can help you avoid paying taxes. Because the city of London is basically one of the main epicenters, if not the main epicenter of that in the entire world. During this time, this is when Epstein is claiming to have worked for the CIA, and he already is owning homes across the entire country. I don't think he's had homes in France or England yet, but, he's owning places across the United States already. Again, this all makes sense. He probably is doing some sort of deals as assets of the CIA. Not on the official payroll, obviously, but it all seems to connect to the sort of offshore moving money around, hiding money, hiding assets, washing money. That's it. That seems to be how he got his start. And he's also meeting with arms dealers, and he might be involved in the Iran-Contra with Adnan Khashoggi, or at least in some capacity. So in an interview, I think it's still the only interview he's done, Julian Leese, the son of Douglas Leese, has acknowledged that his father was a mentor to Epstein. And in Whitney Webb's book, she suggests that he was learning arms dealing and money laundering from both Douglas Leese and Khashoggi. And Julian, he's denied that his father was an arms dealer. And Webb also says that there are claims that Douglas Leese threw very unusual parties at his house back in the 1970s. I don't know what that means or what that suggests, but just throwing it out there. And that these three were somehow, Khashoggi, Leese, and Epstein were somehow also arms trafficking or making deals for Israel, or the UK portion of the deals between China and Iran and Israel, or some variation of that. So if we go into the Julian Leese interview, he says that his father was not an arms dealer. He was involved in selling civil defense radar and aircraft. He was a broker for companies. And he said that the way Epstein came into his family's life was in 1981, Julian's brother met Epstein at a party in Texas. It was like a birthday party for a Texas oil baron, and Epstein was with his girlfriend at the time named Paula. And later, through Julian's brother, Epstein gets introduced to the family, and a sort of mentorship with Douglas Leese starts to take place. He starts to describe Epstein, saying that he played the harpsichord, he was very intelligent, and would always ask questions on all sorts of topics, wanting to know all he could about UK society. He says that during this time in the 80s, he doesn't remember that Epstein ever lived in the UK, but he says he made plenty of trips and had a very substantial contact base there. Julian also says that he never heard Epstein ever talk about Maxwell during these times, Robert Maxwell or Ghislaine, and that Douglas Leese didn't know either of them either. Julian also says that while his father was a mentor to Jeffrey, he wasn't really seriously involved in his business. He would be at some meetings with defense contacts through Douglas, and he would also give advice on contracts, stocks, finance. This is very much how Epstein seems to be involved, at least early on. I think he expands his operations later with help from intelligence, getting intelligence deals, brokering meetings and things like that, and meeting people. He's a connector. But the finance angle seems to be really how he got involved, at least in the first 15, 20 years. Not just making money from people like Wexner later, but he obviously had some cash if he had homes all over the United States. Julian says that Epstein wanted as many contacts as possible and learned as much as he could from Douglas Leese. So again, he's trying to develop his ability to influence and make deals, just like Adnan Khashoggi, who Julian says there was no mention of him either from Douglas or Jeffrey Epstein about Khashoggi. And he says that Douglas Leese didn't know Khashoggi till later on. He never met him until later. So by 1984, the Epstein and Douglas Lease friendship comes to an end. Epstein had been booking rooms and flights on Douglas's expense account, and he was hurt by this. He was pissed and cut Epstein off, and they had no more contact after that. So Hoffenberg, the guy who ran Towers Financial that Epstein would later be involved in, and I believe this was a Ponzi scheme that Hoffenberg was convicted of, and Epstein, once again, gets away scot-free. And he says that this introduction between Lease and Epstein happened in 1988. And Julian says no, that this was obviously after the 1984 fallout between the two, and that Julian was actually the connection, that Jeffrey called Julian to offer him an internship at Towers Financial, and Julian introduced later Hoffenberg to Douglas Lease. Jeffrey Epstein did not make this introduction. And Hoffenberg, he claims that Towers Financial was clean until Epstein showed up, and Epstein's like, no, this guy's a fucking crook. And Epstein later sued Hoffenberg for defamation. I don't know if that case ever got resolved before his death. Maybe it was earlier. And that Hoffenberg also said that Epstein didn't pay back money. And it was this back and forth. There's a lot of animosity there between those two. So with the Julian interview, we get a little bit more clarity about some of the operations of Epstein during the 1980s. And Julian says that Epstein would always talk about how he'd been lonely and wish he'd started a family and had kids. And says that he always had women around, Epstein, but they were all above the age of 21. Okay. And other people interviewed by Tom Pattinson, who ran this podcast series, told him that Hoffenberg was not a reliable narrator. That's the Julian Lease side of things. So Whitney Webb, in her book, the story is that Douglas Lease was allegedly involved with Epstein in deals selling Chinese weapons to Iran, and there was a revenue sharing deal with Khashoggi and Douglas Lease. And this was a parallel operation to Iran-Contra, and that Khashoggi was, according to some sources, a client of Jeffrey Epstein by 1983. And Whitney Webb also points out that connections through Roy Cohn and Khashoggi and BCCI, the bank, the corrupt bank, could have already exposed Jeffrey Epstein to the workings of sexual blackmail operations, as BCCI was already doing procurement for Middle Eastern rulers to get prostitutes from Pakistan mainly. Male or female, and the ages varied, also underage in that case. Whitney Webb's interview with Ari Ben-Menashe. Ben-Menashe also says that by the 80s, Epstein already had ties to Israeli intelligence, and he was also a double or triple agent. So I think U.S., Israel, and probably British intelligence for sure. And he says that by this time, mid-80s, Ehud Barak and Robert Maxwell were already involved. And this involved arms deals from Israel to Iran. And Ben-Menashe said that Epstein would often be at Robert Maxwell's office between trips to and from Israel. And as late as 2008, during his initial arrest and court cases, he made a trip to Israel where he visited Israeli military bases. And this was during his trial. So if that's true, that kind of holds up the idea of Epstein as working for the Israelis in some capacity, working with the Israelis. And we'll see further examples of that. But I think we can now get into the Adnan Khashoggi aspect of this, a comparative look at Khashoggi and how he operated versus Epstein and the massive overlaps between them. We don't have much in terms of their direct ties to one another, but in the Adnan Khashoggi story about his lifestyle and how he operated, you'll see a lot of the same beats being hit as Jeffrey Epstein would later do. But Khashoggi was the Saudi version of this, and a lot more public-facing than anything Epstein would do.
We'll be right back.
All right, since I brought up Adnan Khashoggi, let's do a deep dive into how he operated. How did Khashoggi use his lifestyle to facilitate multi-billion-dollar deals back in through the 1980s at his peak and further on a little bit. Not to the same extent, but Adnan Khashoggi and Jeff, as we call them, they have a lot of similarities in terms of how they went about making deals and trying to exert influence. So Khashoggi, he was a lot more public about it. He was, at one time, the richest man in the world, and very much trying to cultivate an image of himself as someone who wasn't just an arms dealer. In fact, he didn't want to be known as that at all. That's not how he thought of himself. And both of these guys, in interviews with people who knew them or were surrounded by them, are held up as being quite socially adept, having charisma and just generally trying to get people to trust them, having people wanting to hang around them, not just for potential blackmail that could be had on people. That was probably part of it for both of them. But remember, in terms of the Epstein files, not everyone who was involved in any sort of sexually compromised activities, whether with adults or children, teenagers, whatever the case may be. You get celebrities and other supposed important people to attend parties or various events. You try to leverage them, but if not, you've created the ambiance that makes the others that you can get something out of feel like they are a part of the social elites, even if in actuality they're just tech dorks or other stupid science bitches that have no game. So if you can throw random women at them, in the case of the guys who weren't with underage girls, if you can throw women at them, they think it's magic, because even though they made all the money, they never got that social aspect of their lives satisfied. Now, Khashoggi, he created access to important people or business leaders through his lavish entertaining. It was on a scale way larger than anything Jeffrey Epstein did. Again, he was more public. So Khashoggi's spectacular parties and, as the book says, sumptuous dinners were not merely for his pleasure alone. They provided him with access to various decision makers by hosting world leaders, celebrities, business executives. He would ensure that business would come to him instead of having to seek it out, bring them to you. And he would just spend money like crazy. In the book, The Richest Man in the World, that I read on Adnan Khashoggi, he would reportedly spend up to $120 million a year. And that's just in personal expenditures, which is the equivalent of like $500 million today. This was back in the 1980s. And spending like this, it helps to create and reinforce that image that he's very important to know. He's very influential. That aura of mystery and invincibility made Adnan Khashoggi appear as a man of prestige, which is something you want, especially early on, when it was crucial to convince particularly American clients, defense contractors, or government officials that he did indeed have the necessary access to the Saudi government to secure massive contracts. So while Epstein has alleged ties to U.S. intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and various other countries, maybe, Khashoggi was very much loyal to Saudi Arabia. That's where he was from. And he made himself extremely rich off this, but he also was loyal to that government. And it's easier, even easier, to do an arms deal. It's not just money. Or if you want to get some sort of real estate project done, which he also did, it's really easy to do that if you're boys with all of the people who can greenlight it, especially if you're getting these guys laid. So Khashoggi liked to be surrounded by women. He didn't like to be alone. He always felt lonely. And he viewed women, at least in some context, as tools for his business. He believed that creating these glamorous atmospheres, that it would ease the path of making a deal. It helped negotiations. So he frequently would provide beautiful hostesses, call girls, prostitutes, whatever you want to call them. He would provide these women to his friends, associates, Saudi princes, And, he wanted to ensure that people enjoyed their evening and were later ready to negotiate in more convivial terms, more convivial activities. And this tactic he would use, using women, would add further element of excitement that his competitors didn't have. This gave him an advantage. And the more money he made, the more outlandish he could get with it. In general, Adnan Khashoggi didn't directly set anyone up with sex. He was more hands-off, sort of taking an approach of, if anything happens, it just happens. He'd pay the women to be there, and if a guy leaves with them, so be it. It was none of his business. This was in addition to his own extensive personal involvement in whoring. He'd spend insane amounts of money on prostitutes or just flip through magazines to pick out models he'd see, both in fashion publications and ones like Playboy or Penthouse. He would have someone, usually a woman, who would meet the girls, and especially the ones out of the magazine, and make sure that they looked up to par, because an airbrushed magazine picture is quite different from what they may look like in person. So her job was to style them up and shit like that. There's this one guy in the book who tells a story to some investigators of how he started getting in with Adnan's crew while Adnan would come to the US. Pretty sure this was when he was visiting LA, staying at maybe the Beverly Hills Hotel or something. Anyway, this guy Walsh, he brought Adnan 30 different women at once. He basically called up every woman he knew and got them there. And Khashoggi picked out 15 blondes and dismissed the rest. He apparently had a thing for blonde white women, at least that day. And the story is that 2 of them, in addition to whatever money they got paid with a brand new Porsche. And the book, his one-time house manager or butler was a guy named Financier. And here, let me read the section from this. It says, quote, "At least once a month, Khashoggi would import 8 girls at a time. Financier knew when they would be arriving because he was told to prepare the bedrooms for them. They came in from California or Texas or from France on the Concorde. As if handing out Tootsie Rolls, Khashoggi always gave them gold bracelets. Financier had no idea what Khashoggi did with so many girls. It seemed he believed in numbers. He saw them pad from one bedroom to another, visiting each of them in turn, or 2 or 3 at a time. Perhaps they had a jamboree. Financier didn't care to know." So this is what that guy's getting into. A little bit more on the extreme side in terms of numbers, in terms of parties, than Jeffrey Epstein. And obviously Jeff liked him even younger. Maybe Khashoggi did too. I don't know. I don't have any evidence of that. He was also doing this sort of whoremongering in Monaco, both for himself and the guys that Adnan was doing business with, friends and Saudi royals. And there was a case of Muriel Griffon, who was his madam, and he was spending the equivalent of millions of dollars per year in today's dollars just on this one woman's. He was the vast majority of her business. And she would recruit women at the clubs and lounges and bars and whatnot and train them to be more refined escorts. So Khashoggi was married, but he also had these women who were like his girlfriends, a bunch of them who he'd take care of for time periods. And then he would also have whatever prostitutes he was getting with that week. And as he got older, it's like he's not even having sex with them. He's just, I guess, doing that Hugh Hefner thing. This is pre-Viagra, so you don't need the details. Even on YouTube, I saw this interview with this woman who was one of his girlfriends for a couple years, and she was talking about how she loved him. It's like, all right, this woman was like a 20-year-old model. Now imagine for a second that some mid-40s or 50s Middle Eastern guy walks up to a 20-year-old white woman model, an American, a guy who's kind of ugly. Imagine a guy doing this and he wasn't rich. He is not getting past hello unless she has some kind of fetish or he just happens to have God-tier verbal game. Oh, really? You were in love with Adnan Khashoggi? Shut the fuck up. Like, even though he was married and had a bunch of other side pieces, you were just so in love with him. It wasn't the luxury lifestyle and social life that he provided by being the richest man in the world. A giant social connector. I'm sure it was just because He was just so damn hot and seductive. Just as an aside, can we start calling out hoes and their role in these sorts of schemes? Like, they enable so much of this shit. I'm not talking about the ones who are legitimately trafficked. I'm not talking about underage girls. I'm talking about the hoes, the adult hoes who volunteer for this sort of shit, whose vanity and greed and avarice need to be satisfied. So they just link up with these guys who are scumbags, these guys who are, dealing weapons and just generally bad people, and then sell themselves to the highest bidder, just reinforcing this thing. Because women are central to like all of these business dealings and operations, not just in terms of honeypots, but also creating the environment to facilitate deals. At least most of the time, even outside of the Epstein case. Most of the time it's women. Obviously, in some other cases, Epstein included young girls, or I think in the case of the DC Madam, it was gay men or even boys. I'm not sure the exact details of that case. Those are some well-known examples. It's the same fucking thing. And then the modeling agencies, beauty pageants, and prostitution all seem to go hand in hand in a lot of these elite circles. These connectors like Epstein and Khashoggi use these things as tools of the trade. You can see it even far back into the 1960s, the Profumo affair that happened in the UK, which was almost certainly a honeypot operation, but there was also the aspect of the wider world of elite orgies and gay sex happening among the upper crust. That was in danger of being exposed there. There was the story of the elites had some party and there was a masked man wearing like just the skirt of a maid's outfit and nothing underneath. It was like, okay. So anyway, Khashoggi, he has not only the women, he has a bunch of houses, 12 global residences, and a private fleet of aircraft, not only for himself. They served a dual purpose and would offer them as private retreats for heads of states or important business clients who he might need in the future. So he would do a favor for them, letting them stay in one of his houses. And he frequently lent his private planes, including he had a DC-9 and a 727, and he would let King Hussein of Jordan or the leader of Sudan at the time, and even Howard Hughes. That was the plane that Howard Hughes, when he got sent to the Bahamas, which was owned by Resorts International, which was CIA front, and probably part of a bribery involving Richard Nixon. And you can see this even later after this, because the Richest Man in the World book only goes up to like 1985. And I saw this clip from Danny Jones' podcast about, I forget who was talking about it, but he told a story about Khashoggi letting the Russians use his French home for a meeting between them and the Chechens. And this was according to the journalist David Satter, who reported that the false flag, the bombing of the apartments, was blamed on Chechen rebels. This was to secure the election after Boris Yeltsin resigned and, to let Putin take power. So they did a false flag bombing, but there was a meeting before that with the Chechens where it was supposedly planned out. And that took place at the home of Adnan Khashoggi in France, allegedly. That was a part of his life in business, this diplomatic role. Just this connector, which we see later with Epstein, the friendship between Epstein and the head of DP World, the guy from the United Arab Emirates, then leveraging his relationship there to his relationship that included Ehud Barak and other high-ranking Israeli officials, and trying to bring them together to work on port deals, security arrangements, and eventually, according to one article I read, the Abraham Accords that took place in 2020. So after Epstein died, but Epstein was sort of central to bringing them together. The United Arab Emirates got turned down, got blocked from buying ports in the United States in 2006 because they didn't have enough clout, they didn't have enough representation in Washington. And Epstein was used as a go-between to try to help facilitate more business deals for the United Arab Emirates, I guess in the United States and later in Israel. So Adnan Khashoggi, his lifestyle, allowed him to act like a diplomat without official titles. Very much like Epstein here. The privacy he had afforded by his yachts and planes and homes enabled him to host these sorts of secret negotiations and facilitate meetings between world leaders, presidents in the United States. He was the one who arranged Prince Fuad's visit to Richard Nixon back in the 60s, I think. So you see how he connects people, both through women, through use of his houses, creating a neutral territory where people can discuss and do diplomacy or hash out business deals. He used his wealth to establish what the book calls tokens of esteem with key Saudi princes. These princes would approve his contracts, and he would furnish their homes and provide them with yachts when they needed it, in order to facilitate his rise in Saudi Arabia so that he could keep getting these sorts of defense contracts and whatnot. He would involve princes as partners in his ventures and would sort of funnel millions of dollars to them through Swiss bank accounts. And this would secure for him the political capital, the backing necessary to make these giant deals with defense contractors like Lockheed and Raytheon. Unlike Epstein, his business dealings were much more well known versus how Epstein is still kind of, where the fuck did you get your money? You have the defense contracts, obviously. You have real estate deals, which came later. At one time, Khashoggi was taking 10 to 15% of these deals with Raytheon, Lockheed, Northrop, missile deals, jets, defense systems, radar, all that shit. So with Northrop, for example, Khashoggi acted as the agent for the deal that supplied 100 F-5 planes to Saudi Arabian military. And one specific phase of this deal was reportedly a $45 million commission to Mr. Khashoggi, which at the time was like the biggest fee ever. So that's how he got so rich. And he eventually became the reason that in the United States they passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Though again, he did go beyond just the defense contracts, and he was the middleman for other deals between countries. For instance, later on, he would be involved in China. When China was rising, he would broker a deal with Indonesia in China, where China would sell their early marine engines in exchange for bauxite from Indonesia. Very much like the involvement with Epstein and UAE in Israel and trying to get the lobbying influence after the port deal. So this is what Epstein was about partially. Did he also handle taxes and offshoring beyond just being a broker? Yeah, maybe not for himself. Was he involved in the sexual blackmail? Probably. And obviously, the sexual proclivities he had for himself, not just in terms of blackmail, but securing teenage girls for, we don't need to get into it. But I doubt that Epstein was some kind of tax genius, but I do think that he had enough contacts to be a connector for wealthy people, to be a conduit for dirty sources of intelligence funding and or other assorted criminals. God knows who else he was connected to. There are those stories about him being in the UK as early as the 1970s, making contacts there, and then for sure throughout the 80s, as Julian Leese and Hoffenberg tell it in their interviews. In the 1970s, he was apparently there to be a concert pianist for some shows and met people then. Really kind of not a lot of information on that. But him developing contacts before Prince Andrew makes sense in the context of him being a sort of a financier and tax fixer. So what is the main core of offshore banking and trusts and general tax evasion, especially during this time period and up until today? The City of London. Now, if you don't know, the City of London is a separate entity within what you would think of as London. This is the center of finance, and it operates at least quasi-independently from the rest of England and even London itself. Going back to the end of the Second World War, the British and French were trying to maintain their empires during the war and after the war, but couldn't do so in any direct way. So a lot of the former colonies became a way for them to financially keep. In the case of Britain, they wanted to keep London as the center of financial power. As such, offshore havens that are technically not part of the country, but the UK still has de facto control over lots of these islands. The government is on paper independent, but everybody kind of knows what the deal is. So there's lots of sinks all over the world to rinse dirty money and hide taxable income from whatever country you come from. But Epstein, I think he fits into this. He worked for Bear Stearns. He's involved in Towers Financial, that Ponzi scheme, I guess. And then he goes off on his own, continues to vaguely be connected to finance, and nobody seems to know anything about how he got rich. Obviously, we have the Wexner and Leon Black connections, which probably helped a lot and probably gave him a lot of money. But I think this connection to the offshore world starts to make sense. He buys an island in the Bahamas, goes to England a lot. The Bahamas just happen to be one of these island countries, not to the same level as the Caymans, but it's always been a place where, as a tax haven, and the Resorts International, the casino on there, the whole saga back in the 60s, Operation Trade Winds as an investigation into offshore tax havens back in the day. Epstein is a finance guy, at least on the surface. He can still do financial schemes while also working on certain things for different intelligence agencies. Again, mainly the Israel and US, possibly the UK too. Robert Maxwell is the connection there to the UK. Robert Maxwell did business with the UK as an asset, the Americans, I think, and Russia. So Epstein, like Adnan Khashoggi, is sort of a utility player. He can play any role that you need him to, and as the emails show, Jeffrey Epstein is in contact with all sorts of higher-ups in business and government around the world. He was also a useful guy to carry out the acquisition of the sexual aspects of what these people desire, some of which is probably going to be used to blackmail. In the case of the people that had that desire for underage girls, that's an easy way to get things done. Blackmail them. For other people that weren't into that, you can just hire adult escorts like Khashoggi did and try to entice them that way. There's no need for blackmail in that case. It's just like, yeah, you're doing this favor for me. I'll do a deal with you. It's not that difficult, but that's how a lot of these things work. If you want to do these deals, you have to satisfy the lust and taboo desires of some middlemen, military brass, high-level officials, businessmen. You want that fighter jet contract? Well, your go-between to the RAF is some guy named Lord Harold Powerbottom. And you know what he wants? Boy pussy. In other countries, it'll be Anwar bin Talal rape dungeon. Or with Israel, probably some guy named Inappropriate Tuchowitz. And Tuchowitz, he demands nothing older than a 5th grader in order to do the deal. He needs Palit's Gash and the child. And you need, in exchange, critical military hardware or information. Are you going to supply it? Well, that's what the system demands. Things that happen within the framework in order to satisfy the demand of this construct are insane. You know, you can go back to the terrorism that was committed in the Vietnam War, the bombing of German civilians that gets ignored in the end of World War II, the mass fire bombings of those cities. My God. You can come back to America and look into the plutonium files, the nuclear test on the environment and injections into people, injecting people with plutonium, feeding orphans oatmeal that's laced with uranium, I think it was. You can talk about the uranium mining, the downwind effects of all this nuclear testing. It goes on and on. You can be served as a sacrifice to this system.
Recall the details of this photo, recall the photo being taken.
No, I don't think I ever knew the photo was taken.
Okay, and for those who can't see it, it's a photo of you in a hot tub. There's a person next to you here. Do you remember where it was taken? Where was it taken?
I'm almost sure that this pic, and I think there's an adjacent photograph, which you probably have, that if people saw it, they would feel that someone was trying to con them showing this picture. But anyway, this picture was taken in Brunei.